Go ahead and get started. We are recording for anybody that's just joining us. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the June Successful Gardener class. My name is Christina Culp, and I'm one of the Union County Extension Master Gardeners. We host this series on the first Thursday of every month, 7 o'clock. And lately, at least in the last year or year and a half, we record these and post them to our YouTube channel. And if you don't know where that is, shoot me an email at casey@christinaculp.com, and I will let you. I will send it to you, or you can put something in the chat box if you want to. Next month, Mary Roberts with Windcrest Farms, she's the owner of Windcrest Farms, is going to join us to discuss how we can manage our gardens in the heat of July. I think I should have moved this earlier because it was, I think, 93 here today, and it looks like a crispy desert out here in my window. So maybe we'll have to move that kind of talk a little earlier, but we'll still have her in July, and that will help. We have the full Successful Gardener calendar is on our website, and I'll put that and the detail list URL in the chat box so you can copy those over and have that. Also, if you're interested in becoming a Master Gardener in Union County, we have training, and it's rather extensive training. You don't need to know much about plants to start. You don't need to know anything about plants to start, but you will know plenty when you're done. But it is a volunteer organization, so the kind of the reason that we exist is to help other people learn about plant and plant related things. So if you're interested, I will post that link in the chat box too. Tonight, we have Dr. Matt Bertone, who is the Director and Diagnostic Entomologist, that's a great title, with the NCSU Plant Disease and Insect Clinic. And he is here to discuss insects. And as I mentioned before on the website and last month, this class may go on just a little bit longer than usual. And if you need to leave, that's fine. We've got it recorded and we will post it. So you'll be able to see the whole thing. The general idea here is to talk about the bad guys versus the good guys. And you may have met him virtually through the monthly pest and pathogens presentations. A lot of us Master Gardeners view those. In his work at NC State, he focuses on the tools and techniques of insect identification. And of course, that is really important to help clients with their pest management issues and monitoring invasive and emerging pests and providing accurate diagnoses and nomenclature for species involved in scientific research. So he spends all day thinking and working with insects. Some days I feel like I do that too in the garden. He also provides training to state extension, and tonight he's going to do some training for us. So if you're in the yard much at all, you know that there are insects, maybe more than you care to have out there, but they are very, very important to gardeners. And you know, there are some people that feel like the only good bug is a dead bug, and that is really, really not true. So hopefully by the end of this, we will know a little bit better the things that we need to be worried about and the things that we need to really host and get more of. So we'll put please put your questions in the chat box, and we'll fill those toward the end of the talk. And like I said, I will post the recording on our YouTube channel, hopefully by the end of the week, but you know, or not the end of next week, but you know how things go. So I will hand it over to Matt and look forward to this one. Thanks, Matt.
Great, thank you. And thank you for inviting me. And I hope you all can hear me all right. Um, I'm gonna try and go through this fairly quickly because I don't have a ton of time tonight and there's lots of things to talk about. I'm basically gonna present two presentations. This is gonna be more on kind of the pests with a couple of beneficials, but then I'm gonna give a short talk on kind of general beneficial arthropods afterward. And so don't worry about furiously writing notes. I'll be sharing these presentations with you all later on. So just listen. I'll probably skip over a few things just to get through the talk, so people aren't staying up too late, and so we also have time for questions. And so here we go. So I'm just going to cover this as a fairly short talk. Of course, there's thousands of species of insects and other arthropods in North Carolina. In fact, just spiders alone, there's 700 species at least. So we have many, many things out there. So I'm going to be discussing mostly the most common things. And because there's so many landscape plants out there and ornamentals, there's all different things, depending on what you plant in your yard that could be a pest. So I'll be trying to talk about the most common things you might see. And of course, if you can't figure out what you're seeing, and if I haven't mentioned it during this talk, you can always ask us or try some online resources to identify it. And we'd be glad to help you identify your pests. And I do also want to stress that I mainly focus on identification and biology of these insects and other arthropods. I don't talk a lot about control because there are other specialists in the department. And also, identification is the most important step. Once you have an identification, you can basically search Lacebug, NC State University, and you're going to find a fact sheet that's going to tell you how to manage them, a little bit about them. But if you don't know what you have in front of you, you're lost. You really don't know what you're going to be looking for and whether you're going to be getting the right information. So identification is the most important part of all of this stuff. So I'm going to start off with true bugs. It's a huge group of insects. These are the only insects that you can truly call bugs, and entomologists call bugs, although I don't care if you call all insects bugs or all arthropods bugs. And these insects are characterized by having sucking mouth parts. So they feed only on liquids. But luckily for them, almost all organisms are full of liquids anyway. So we're full of liquid, so are plants. So things bite us like bed bugs, and things bite plants like certain leafwood bugs and hoppers and things like that. So many of the groups of insects that feed on sap, water, basically it's water with a lot of sugar, also need fats and proteins. And because they get so much sugar water, they actually filter out all those other nutrients and excrete this excess sugar water called honeydew. Sometimes it can even rain down from trees. And in fact, if you park your car under a tree in the summer and you get all these little sticky spots on the windshield, that's honeydew from some kind of insect up there. So I will mention when insects produce honeydew because there are a couple important things about it. So the first thing is that honeydew, being a sugary substance, attracts a lot of other insects, especially ants. So if you see ants in your plants, they don't actually feed on plants. They are feeding on the honeydew of some kind of pest there. So if you follow those ants up a plant and look for those insects, you may find aphids or mealybugs or some kind of pest there. So they're an indirect kind of thing. And these ants will actually protect those herds of honeydew producing insects, which can decrease or increase their numbers, basically. Flies and wasps will also often visit this. And there's another issue with honeydew, and that's when it lands on surfaces, there's a group of fungi called sooty molds that like to grow on that sugary substance. They can grow on all different surfaces. They're not a plant pathogen. They don't infect the plant. They can also grow on objects that are left outside under trees that have a lot of honeydew producing insects. And these are superficial molds, but they can inhibit photosynthesis. They make the plants look bad. And basically, controlling the insects is the number one priority because if you reduce the amount of honeydew, then you can reduce the amount of sooty mold, and eventually it'll wear away. Also note that if you have honeydew on a plant, that doesn't mean that that's the plant that actually has the pests. So if you have a tree above a plant and that tree has a lot of aphids that are raining down honeydew on the other plants, they will grow sooty mold on them, but that's not actually where the pests are. So you'll want to scout for those pests to control them. Okay, so the first group of insects that is very common in gardens and in landscapes, all of them basically feed on plants, are the aphids. These are small, soft-bodied insects that are almost always found in groups. You rarely ever see one. And that's because they reproduce asexually most of the time, where females will give live birth to young that then are already pregnant and give birth to young very quickly after that too. And so you get these huge colonies building up, and basically they infest a plant. They can transmit viruses. They can directly affect plants, but many of them will be unnoticed otherwise. And these things produce a lot of honeydew as well. Now, they do have really complicated life cycles. They go through asexual and sexual generations over the year. Some alternate hosts from woody plants to herbaceous plants. Many produce a wax, or some even produce galls. And the most important feature for identifying aphids is typically they're going to have these tailpipe like structures, a pair of them that look almost like extra antennae or legs, called siphuncules or cornicles. And these produce alarm pheromones that when one aphid is getting attacked, it'll release those. And when the other aphids smell it, they know a predator's around and they'll drop to the ground, or they'll crawl away or something like that. Now, aphids come in all different shapes and sizes. I'm not going to talk about any specific ones because there are hundreds of species, actually, well, thousands of species in the world, and hundreds of them in North Carolina, ranging from, these woolly, there's a non-native hackberry aphid, to these very giant ones. This is on the top of an acorn, and you can see how large that aphid is. One of our largest, basically the largest aphid we have around, to ones with racing stripes and whatnot. And even single species come in different colors. So if you want to know what species you have, unless it's really distinct, like this waxy hackberry aphid, you're going to have to slide mount them and look at very tiny structures on that. And I don't expect any of you to do that, but just note that if you want to know what species you have in a garden and you're asking me, I'm going to have to get specimens and look at them very close up to figure out what type of aphid it is. Now, jumping plant lice are an aphid-like insect. They're kind of a cross between an aphid and a tiny cicada. They have more antennal segments than aphids and are much more harder bodied and have much more wing venation than aphids. And they're only a few millimeters long, but they do have a kind of different stage when they're younger. They often look very different than the adults. And they're fairly host specific, though. I should mention aphids can be very host specific. Some groups are only found on a single type of plant. Others are found on hundreds of families of plants, for instance. Jumping plant lice are pretty host specific. It's rare that they're on more than one genus or one type of plant, basically. They're, when you find one, if you know what plant you have, then you can figure out what jumping plant louse you have. And they are called jumping plant lice because they do hop. They're very tiny and they hop. But a couple of the common ones you might see, the boxwood psyllid is one of the main pests of boxwoods. Although I'd say it's one of the more minor of the three pests that I'm going to talk to you about today. And the young produce honeydew and produce wax, and they feed on the new growth and that causes this cupping, and all the leaves will be cupped together. And if you open them up, you'll see these little tiny nymphs or adults. I think you can see one right here. They're very small. If you can see a boxwood leaf, you can see how tiny these insects are. But they look. This is a nymph. It's got the wings developing, and it's producing this wax. For these, you could just cut out the new growth that has them and destroy that. Chemical control is usually not necessary, but they can be present when the new growth comes out. And there are lots of other psyllids out there. There's ones that gall Yaupon hollies. There's ones that do other things. There's a whole group that make galls on hackberries, for instance, but they're fairly common in the environment, but many of them don't cause any real damage to plants. Okay, whiteflies are another closely related group. These are tiny white waxy insects with almost no wing venation, and some are very serious pests. They can produce honeydew, and some actually transmit viruses to plants. They are very difficult to identify from the adults because most of them look just about like this. And even for experts like me, it can be very difficult. But the pupae, this resting stage in between their immature stage and the adult stage, and this is one species you see here, these black things are actually the pupal resting stage. The pupae are much more distinct, and those are what are used to ID these whitefly species. So we have a couple different whiteflies that are common in North Carolina. Citrus whitefly has these kind of flat, disc-like pupae that have these yellow lines on them, almost making a Y. They feed. I most commonly see them on gardenia, privet, and ash, but they're on all different types of hosts. And they do produce a lot of honeydew, which can lead to sooty mold. So if your gardenia's sooty, you can shake the branches. If you see little tiny white insects flittering around, you'll probably have whiteflies. Look on the undersides of the leaves, you'll probably see these little tiny coin-like things. Greenhouse whiteflies are a bit different. The pupae are much more three-dimensional off the surface, and they have a crown of seedy around the top. These are more common in greenhouses and in really warm times of the year. You can see them all here, all these pupae on the underside of a tomato leaf. So they are very tiny again. And these also do produce honeydew as well. Okay, now scale insects are very similar to whitefly pupae, and they may be mistaken for them sometimes. But in scale insects, the females especially are always going to be kind of nondescript, don't even look like insects basically. They lack all these obvious features. I mean, if you were to tell a general person that this is an insect, they would probably not believe you. But that's actually there's an adult insect under there feeding on the plant. So what they do is these groups, they have a crawler stage that has legs and crawls around. And then when it settles, it starts to feed and it starts to develop. And the males develop into a fly-like insect that will fly around and mate with the females because the females don't move once they're basically nestled in and feeding on the plant. These often require slide mounting to ID, and species may have broad or narrow host range. So some species are very specific to a certain plant, and if you know the plant and know what the scale looks like, you could probably guess what type it is. Others can be on a lot of different types of plants. Cottony cushion scales are a very large, primitive type scale. They're not native to North America. They were introduced in the late 1800s from Australia accidentally. Um, they have these large legs, and the females are almost a half-inch long once they produce these long white wax ovisacs. And inside, this is where they'll create the eggs. These don't often infest huge amounts on the plants, but you'll see them here and there. And they feed on a bunch of different plants. So just be aware of them. I will mention one, another type of scale insect that looks fairly similar, but I'll tell you how to tell the difference. Uh, and these do produce honeydew, I think. Soft scales, on the other hand, are a very common group of scales. They do produce honeydew as well. They start off typically as softer and flat scales, although some species remain this way, but often they become large and warty, hard and crusty. And if you take it off the plant, you got to take off the entire insect. Sometimes there'll be eggs underneath or crawlers underneath. And they typically produce egg or crawlers once a year, depending on the species, will be the time of year that it depends on, basically. Some are present only indoors or in greenhouses. They can become very large issue inside on indoor plants sometimes. And for instance, staghorn ferns get them a lot. But there's a lot of variety of these out there. So here's some of the ones that you might find out there. The tulip tree scales are very large and showy looking, about the size of a pea. So they're fairly large for scale insects. Oaks get lecanium scales, which are these shiny brown ones. Wax scales, there are a few different varieties of species of wax scales out there, and they have this very thick white waxy coating, and that coating is almost like dried toothpaste. Inside that is this reddish insect that if you squish it, it'll bleed red. And they're typically not infesting in huge numbers. This type, they usually are, one here or there. Sometimes you get heavier infestations, but they often like woody plants, and you'll see them contrasting on the bark. And then you have cottony scales. These are not to be confused with cottony cushion scales, even though they look very similar. They're going to have much smaller legs, and these are much more common. And we see them a lot on things like the cottony camellia scale, especially, is on camellia, but also yews, taxus, those conifers, and also on hollies and others. Maples get a different species, but they often have a very long, white, waxy ovisac, very cottony looking. Mealybugs are another scale insect. They are more mobile than most, and they'll crawl around a little bit. But they're called mealybugs because they have this mealy, waxy, mealy coating all over them. And they often have these rays of wax coming out of them, sometimes very long. This is the long-tailed mealybug, or these kind of fiberglass-like wax filaments coming out of them. These are found on many plants and plant parts, but typically they're in more of an indoor pest and greenhouse pest, but we have seen infestations outdoors before. They do produce a lot of honeydew and can contribute to sooty mold, and some are actually root feeding. So if you pull up a weed and you see these little things on the roots, it could be actually mealybugs that live underground. They're fairly difficult to ID except for when you slide mount them. Then we come to the armored scales. This is probably the most common group of scales, one of the most destructive. They're typically small, usually only a few millimeters wide. And after settling, the female develops this thick covering that's called a test. So this is an azalea twig, and I've removed the covering from this one female, and each one of these is another female inserted under the bark. They usually have this little kind of golden spot on them somewhere, and that's the skin of the first instar, the young crawler. It doesn't produce the covering yet, and once it molts and produces the covering, this little shed skin stays on top. And as you can see, they're very simple. They have these are the antennae up here, these two little things. This is the mouth parts. There's no legs. And basically, I have to look at this region of the body for all these little features to identify the species. Now, one thing to note about these is they do not produce honeydew. They feed on individual cells of the plant, and if they were to produce honeydew, they would drown themselves under their covering. And so they do not. So if you have a honeydew problem or a sooty mold problem, they are not contributing to it. However, they are sometimes associated with a fungus called felt fungus. This will grow usually on woody plants. It'll grow on limbs. It'll be this thick coating of fungus, usually brownish or black. We see it a lot on black gum and oaks and things like that, but it can get on a lot of different plants. And if you were to scrape away the fungus and scrape under the bark a little bit, you'll see that the bark is green underneath. It's a healthy plant. It's not a pathogen, but this thick mat of fungus is actually feeding on the scale insects. So if you see this fungus, you know you actually have the scale insects. Now here's some examples of armored scales. Probably one of the smallest and one of the most common. Um, oh, I have an annotation request. Oh, I don't think I need to annotate right now, but thank you. Okay, so and can you hear me all right still?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay. Um, so T scale is one of the smallest and one of the most common armored scales, and it's most common on camellia, which is actually the tea plant. But they get on a few things like hollies and things, and you'll see them if you look on the top side of the leaves, you'll see yellow patches, and if you flip them over, and I would tell you to do this. You should do this when you next time you're out with your camellias or hollies. Look underneath, and you'll see this waxy dusting and all these little tiny oyster shell things, and those are all armored scales. Euonymus scale. Here's the males, developing males, and these oyster shell types are the females. And these will kill euonymus plants. They will encrust them and kill euonymus plants. Many of the conifers, like Leyland cypress and arborvitae, have these minute cypress scales. They look like a fried egg, and they have a very papery test. And maples get gloomy scales, which look like these little warts all over them. And if you remove the test, these are scales. And if you remove the test, you see the soft female underneath. Super common group of insects, can be just kind of out there in low numbers, but can be also very high numbers and can stress plants out. But also note that stressed plants are more susceptible to some of these insects as well. So you've got to figure out what came first and whether it's something that's really primary or something that's there because the tree is stressed or the plant is stressed otherwise. Okay, other bugs. You mentioned in the email about squash bugs. I'm not going to talk about those, but if you have any questions about those, I could tell you or bring up something about them. One of the major other bugs that we get out there, I'm not going to talk about stink bugs or some others. They're kind of minor, but lace bugs are probably one of the more common pests of plants, and they can produce actual symptoms on the plants. So these are small insects, about 3 millimeters long, with a fine network of lacy sculpturing. They actually almost look like they're very pretty insects. In fact, they look like stained glass windows. And they're fairly host specific. So if you know what host you have, for instance, this is an azalea. This is the azalea lace bug. Its close cousin won't infest azalea, but will infect or infest Andromeda, so Pieris. So they're fairly host specific. They're often found on the undersides of leaves, and they often leave dark fecal spots and eggs and things like that and shed skins. But most people, when they see them, especially on azaleas, and look very similar to this, they'll see these white star or white stippling marks. And if all you have to do is flip over the leaf, if you see little fecal spots or even the actual insects themselves, you know you have lace bugs. And they do have several generations per year. I will note that when you're using, if you're using any chemical controls, you'll have to apply it to the bottoms, the undersides of the leaves. Okay, moving on to some insects with complete metamorphosis. These have a larval stage and a pupal stage before the adult stage. Let's talk about a couple wasps. So these aren't the stinging wasps, but these are things that will be eating plants or associated with plants. And the first are the sawflies. The larvae are caterpillar-like and often found in groups. The adults are wasp-like, but they're with a thick waist, and they don't sting. They have a saw-like ovipositor, which they use to inject eggs into plant material. And there are various families. Some are found on conifers and others on hardwoods. They can defoliate and some skeletonize plants. So these are elm sawflies feeding on an elm leaf. Um, Now, they look very, very similar to caterpillars. So how do you tell them apart? Well, this is the slide I use in just about every talk. Sawflies versus caterpillars. So caterpillars, which are the larvae of moths and butterflies, they will have 5 or fewer pairs of these fleshy false legs called prolegs on their abdomen. And each one of those prolegs will have little hooks on the tips in true caterpillars. In sawfly larvae, they have 6 or more pairs of prolegs, and they don't have any little hooks on the tips of their prolegs. Furthermore, the sawfly larvae only have one eye lens called a stema, and plural is stomata, and there's 6 of them in the caterpillars, and so they're usually arranged in a semicircle. Also, I will say that there's only one sawfly I know of that's hairy, and it is a common pest of rose called the bristly slug sawfly. But otherwise, sawflies typically don't have hairs on them, whereas caterpillars are often at least a little bit hairy, just like this, or very hairy, like woolly bears or things like that. Another wasp that you'll see associated with plants are the gall wasps. There's a huge group of wasps that almost always attack oaks. They're on a few other plants like some roses and blackberries and a few others, but for the most part, they're going to be attacking oaks. But there's many species that attack each species of oak, and they produce all different weird tumor-like growths on them. So this is the wool sower gall. If you go out and look at your oaks, especially white oaks, you'll find these puffy white balls that can be almost the size of a golf ball with pink spots on it. Inside, there's actually the developing larva of a wasp. These wasps can't sting you, and typically they don't actually hurt the trees. They just look unsightly. So really, don't be worried about it. You can tell people not to be worried about them. It's in very rare cases where they may infest the stems or the twigs of the oaks, which can cause girdling or weakening of them. But in low numbers or typical numbers, they're not a problem. And honestly, they're very difficult to control anyway. So basically, just leave them be. But if you have weird growths on the leaves or the stems or something like that, it's almost certainly going to be a gall wasp, although there are some flies and other insects that will make galls on oaks. But as far as gall wasps go, most of them are going to be on oaks. Okay, some caterpillars. So these are the young of butterflies and moths. And first one is the bagworm. I think most people are pretty familiar with bagworms. They're called bagworms because the young, the larvae, tie little bits of debris, usually from their host plant, onto their body with silk and make a little case. Um, at this time of year, it's probably a good time to check plants if you have infestations of them before, because they're going to be the very small larvae that are susceptible to chemical control on the plants right now. Right now is when they're hatching. They've probably already hatched from the bags, and basically they have one generations per year. And so I'll describe the life cycle. Starting now, you're going to have the very young larvae hatching or the young larvae feeding on the plants. They're going to grow to bigger larvae. Once they're the big larvae, they're very difficult to control, although you can just grab them off the plant and drown them or do something, destroy them some other way. Then what happens is after they fed enough, they tie off their bag to a branch, and the males will develop into a moth that will pop out. The females never leave the bag. They stay in the bag their whole entire life. And what happens is the male will come and mate with the female inside the bag. He'll mate with the bag technically, but the female will be in there. And when he's done, he dies. And she then lays eggs inside the bag and she dies inside the bag. And then those eggs overwinter, and then at this time of year when it warms up, the eggs hatch, and the little tiny caterpillars crawl out of the bag and then start feeding, creating new bags and new populations. Now, it should be noted, if you have these hanging bags, I would say, right now you're going to have active larvae, not adults yet. What you'll want to do is remove the bags later on, or remove the larvae. And especially if you have the bags on over the winter, that's the best time to remove them, because they're going to be containing, if they have females in them, they'll have eggs as well. And you can remove all those eggs, hundreds of eggs at a time, just by getting rid of the bags. But note, you don't want to just rip it off the plant. You want to cut that little thread the silk that's encircling the twig. If you leave it there, the silk is so strong that it can actually strangle that twig and cause death to that plant from there up. So we have seen that where a twig will start to turn brown and people don't know why. And if you follow it down, you'll find a little silk tie-off from one of these bagworms. Now, they typically eat conifers, but they have broad tastes. This one is on a cherry laurel on campus, so they're not always associated with conifers, although most people do see them on arborvitae and other things. Prominents are very large caterpillars that are going to be present in the summer. You won't see them right now. They're probably present, but they're very small right now. But as they get bigger, and you can see they're very showy, you start to notice them more. These are two different species on the same wild blueberry. And many of them, like the azalea prominent, will feed on blueberries and, of course, azaleas, which are close relatives. They're all both in the family Ericaceae, so the plants. These get large. These get about almost 2 inches long. They'll rear up and they'll spit out noxious fluids, like just bubble at the mouth. This is to protect themselves, of course, from birds and things that want to eat them. So don't eat them. I don't think I have to tell you that, but just don't. They are large, and you'll see them. Sometimes there's some species that congregate on trees together, and they'll twitch together, and they'll shed skins together. It looks really crazy, but honestly, they're typically not a huge pest. They'll feed on some foliage, but we do get questions about them because when they're found in groups, or when they start getting large, they are obviously very, very obvious. Basically, they're very easy to see, and they freak people out sometimes. Now, these turn into a brown moth. Otherwise, they're only around one generation a year. You only really see them around the summer, and you may see them this summer. Fall cankerworms are a type of inchworm. These are typically going to be present in the spring. And so you might say, why are they called fall cankerworms? That's because the adults are active in the fall and winter, and the adult females are actually wingless. So what happens is this time of year, they're probably already in the ground and pupating, but in the spring, the inchworms emerge or hatch from eggs. They'll feed on foliage, and they may drop down from trees on silk lines, and you'll see these little tiny green inchworms hanging down. After they've fed, they crawl down to the ground and pupate, and then around Thanksgiving, or when it starts to get cool, they'll start to hatch as, or emerge as, adults. Again, winged males and wingless females. And again, this is a wingless female. You can tell fall cankerworm larvae from other inchworms in that they have two well-developed prolegs. These are those prolegs I was talking about when I referenced the sawflies. So two pairs of well-developed prolegs, and then they have a little bitty stumpy ones right here as a third pair. They're not really well developed, and that will distinguish it from all other inchworms around, because they do come in various colors as well. Now, another large summer group of caterpillars are going to be the oakworms. These are most commonly, it's going to be the orange striped oakworm, but there's also pink striped oakworms, and they have all these little projections, like thorny projections, and almost fake antennae on their body. They do feed on oaks, as the name implies, And really, we don't see them causing much issue directly to the oaks. Most, mature, healthy oaks can withstand a lot of insect feeding, and they've evolved with a lot of different insects. So you don't really have to worry about foliage feeding on oaks. What does irritate people though is these create a lot of large fecal pellets, large black and green wet fecal pellets about the size of a I don't have a good size. It's about the size of just a little pellet, basically. But these rain down from the oak trees sometimes onto porches and decks and driveways, and they get all green and smeary. And when it rains, they get mushy, and so people don't like that, of course. So unfortunately, the difficulty is that they're often up high in these oak trees, so it's difficult uh, to control them. If you do find a branch that has them, you can prune out that entire branch. They typically feed together. Otherwise, you can let them be. Again, they're not going to hurt the oak. You may want to think about pruning those oak branches back if they're over part of your property you don't want the pellets to come down on. But you'll know if you have these as an issue. Then we have some caterpillars that like to create silken tents in trees. So there are two that you shouldn't confuse: the fall webworms up top and the tent caterpillars at the bottom. So fall webworms create webbing at the tips of branches and occur late in summer and early fall. The tent caterpillars, which are already done their activity, create webbing in the crotches of trees and are in early spring. So they were coming out around late March, early April or so, and they're already gone now. Tent caterpillars typically feed almost mostly on rosaceous hosts. So they'll feed on wild cherries, black cherries, apples, things like that. Um, but fall webworms feed on a lot of different hosts. This is the one that when you're driving down the highway in the summer and you see all those webs in the trees, that's what's making them. These caterpillars are distinguished from others in that they have really long hairs. Their longest hairs are about half the length of the body, and there are no other caterpillars around that'll have that. Tent caterpillars have this white stripe down the back, and are generally fuzzy, but neither of these are venomous or dangerous to touch. Now, as far as their tents, you can see what they look like. These can be pruned out of the tree and destroyed. You're not going to be able to spray anything in there because it's water resistant. You can break them open to allow predators to come in, or you can also spray foliage nearby where they are. Especially if you catch them early, they'll be coming out of the tent to feed on the foliage. But for the most part, since they're late season feeding, especially the fall webworms, they're not going to affect the trees too much. And by that time of year, they've already stored a lot of energy from the summer. It should be noted that tent caterpillars, again, typically nest in the crotches of trees, and you can find sometimes on cherries and apples their foamy egg masses, which overwinter. So if you do have trees that you like and you see these egg masses, you can just scrape those off. That'll destroy that population of tent caterpillars. Now, one of the most important groups, though, of caterpillars, what previous ones I talked about feed on foliage, they typically are not going to harm a tree overall. Trees can withstand a lot of foliage feeding, so we tend to talk about diseases and pests of foliage as being very minor. They may look bad, it may make the tree look bad, but the tree itself or the bush itself isn't typically harmed too much from foliage feeding. This group, on the other hand, is an issue. This group, the clearwing borers, they actually bore into the roots or the stems of plants and can actually kill them sometimes. Um, Unlike most other caterpillars, they are not green. They don't need to be because they're not out on leaves. They're inside of a plant, so they don't need to produce those green pigments. And they may look like some other borer, type of borer, but they will have very short prolegs with these crochets, those little hooks on them. Um, there are lots of different species out there. There are grapevine borers, peach tree borers, lesser peach tree borers, dogwood borers, lilac borers, and also squash vine borers, which I didn't mention. Squash vine borer being one of the few that feeds on herbaceous plants, and they can be extremely destructive. In fact, a colleague on Twitter posted that he's been seeing them laying eggs right now, and he's in Pennsylvania, so already they should be out and active and probably laying eggs on any squash plants you have out there. Um, These insects are very variable. Knowing what host you have may lead you to know what types of borers may come and get them. But basically, for instance, the peach tree borer here, this is one that was in the roots of a cherry laurel, this ornamental plant, and killing the plants because it was boring in the base. The peach tree borer, most of these moths, like their name says, they have these clear wings, and most of them are day-flying wasp mimics. So they look a lot like wasps, and so things don't eat them. They'll lay the eggs near the host or on the host, and the larvae will bore in. And they can sometimes be an issue, but they're kind of sporadic out in the environment. There's very little you can do to control them once they're in the plant, and so it's really making sure that you catch them, get them before the adults lay eggs on the plant, apply sprays to plants where the adults are laying eggs, and that'll get them before they bore in. Okay, thrips. So thrips are a weird group of insects, very tiny insects, in their own group in Thysanoptera. Thrips is both singular and plural. So this is a thrips, and that's a thrips. So make your entomologists proud and never say thrip. It hurts us. And so these are all about 3 millimeters or so, under 3 millimeters in length. They're very tiny insects. Most are plant feeders, though many feed on fungal spores, but some are actually beneficial in feeding on insects and mites. Often they're yellow, but they can be darker. And this group is characterized by having these long, thin, strap-like wings with fringe of hair around them. Hiding the families is difficult, and some of them, though, can transmit diseases, especially the virus, tomato spotted wilt virus, to lots of solanaceous crops. And so they can be really important pests. They also can be very direct pests. So chili thrips, when they feed, they cause distortion of leaves on plants, on the new growth. Many flower thrips, when they feed on the petals, they either suck the color out or they cause petals to get necrotic and brown and things like that. One of the most common groups are the thrips in the genus Frankliniella. Frankliniella occidentalis, the western flower thrips, is a really common pest in greenhouses and can be a pest outdoors as well. And these are small yellow insects. Again, they're only a few millimeters long, so it's tough to see them normally, but they kind of look like little lizards. But you can see those little strap-like wings, and the young are called larvae, and they feed as well. Now, thrips damage can often be identified because you'll see patches of silvery or white where they've sucked the color right out of the plant, and they like to defecate everywhere where they feed. They're really messy and gross. And so you see all these little black fecal specks everywhere. You can see they've even pooped on the trichome here of that. So they leave a lot of mess around where the feeding is done. So that's one way you can tell you've got thrips. One other way too is if you suspect you have thrips, is to take that plant material and bash it on a piece of paper and then put it under the light. And if you see little tiny yellow insects kind of squirming around, flitting about, that's probably thrips you've got. Okay, a few beetles we'll go over. So scarab beetles are a very common group of beetles. They have these special antennae called lamellate antennae, which means they have a club at the end that has like fingers that open up. Some of the most pestiferous ones, the ones people really know, are the Japanese beetle. But white grubs are the larvae of scarab beetles. And so this is a group where the larvae or the adults are both. For instance, Japanese beetles, the larvae can be pests and the adults can be pests. They can actually be pests. So we don't actually see larvae, white grubs being a huge issue in turf, but every once in a while you will get them. I will say the adults are much more common as pests, especially feeding on things like grapes and roses and a lot of plants people like. But note that there are other scarab beetles that are really important. For instance, the dung beetles, the dung scarabs, get rid of dung, and I'll talk about that actually more in the beneficials talk after this. So these are very common, but they also scarabs include the rhinoceros beetles and some of the really important decomposers and ones that are really showy and pretty beautiful. So not all scarabs are pests, but some can be severe pests. Now, chrysomelids are the leaf beetles, and they're extremely diverse. If you were to say these two are related, you probably would be surprised, but they are. They're in the same group, same family. This is a tortoise beetle, and this is a striped cucumber beetle. Their antennae are typically straight and not very clubbed. They may be expanded at the end. Not very long antennae either. They're typically only about half the length of the body, and they have normal eyes. And the larvae are caterpillar or worm-like. Many of the larvae live in soil. Some can be root pests. For instance, the corn rootworm is a famous agricultural pest. It's not an actual worm. It's actually the larva of the spotted cucumber beetle. So these are very common plant feeders. They will chew holes in plants. They will skeletonize leaves, and the larvae may feed on the roots, or even some of the larvae feed on the actual plant and leaves itself. So you'll see them. So here's a variety of leaf beetles. In fact, these Demetina brown oak leaf beetles are out and about right now feeding on oak leaves. But they come in all different forms. You have flea beetles. Many of you have probably heard of flea beetles. They're technically a type of leaf beetle that have very large hind legs and can hop. This, for instance, is the imported willow leaf beetle on a willow leaf. So you can see the adult feeds on the willow leaves, but also the larvae, these caterpillar-like things, feed on the leaves as well. Now, these can be separated from caterpillars and sawflies because they don't have prolegs at all. They only have the true legs on the thorax. And there's a variety of other leaf beetles out there, a hugely diverse group, really interesting. Some of them very beautiful, and many of them just not pests, just out there doing their thing. Now, longhorn beetles are actually a close relative, but very different in a lot of ways. So they have kidney-shaped eyes because their antenna inserts into the eye, and they have very long antennae, either up to half the length of the body or many times the body length. These antennae can be, and that's why they're called longhorn beetles. They're also called roundhead borers because the larvae have these roundish heads and are grubs that live in wood. Um, so it should be noted that longhorn beetles larvae uh, basically attack dead or dying plants and are one of the first things to help decompose plants. There are some species that attack herbaceous plants. In fact, we just got into the clinic some echinacea that had spiral holes in the stem and then a section above it cut. And that's the beetle actually girdling the plant to make dead plant material above it. So when it lays its egg, its larva can feed on the plant better. So when you see longhorn beetles in a plant or a tree or something like that, or them attacking it, note that it's almost certain that that plant is stressed or dying, and these beetles are really attracted to that. Now, there is one species, the Asian longhorn beetle, that is a primary pest of maples, and there's now a population down in Charleston, South Carolina. That is a major pest that they're trying to eradicate. But otherwise, most longhorns are primary decomposers. They're not pests, primary pests, although they can be in certain cases. So again, identifying what you have, what type of plant, what type of damage can be really important on knowing whether they're secondary coming in after it was stressed or they're primary and actually causing the issue. Okay, now weevils are one of the largest groups of beetles. There are about 60,000 species of these in the world. There are only 6,000 species of mammals in the world, just to give you some perspective. So there are 10 times as many weevils as there are all mammals known on Earth. Extremely diverse. They have elbowed antennae and often a long nose. And this is a group also where the adults and or the larvae can be pests. For instance, this two-banded Japanese weevil, the adults chew notches in leaves, whereas vegetable weevils, this species feeds on leaves. Many weevils just are out there in the environment, but some can be serious root or leaf pests or whatnot. Now, larvae of weevils always lack all legs, so they don't have any legs at all, but they have a nice head. And like I said, the adults have elbowed antennae and usually a long nose. Now, a specific type of weevil that don't look like weevils are the bark ambrosia beetles. This is another group that gets a bad rap or gets blamed for a lot of death of plants, when in fact they're just a sign that the plant is stressed or unhealthy. These weevils, these bark and ambrosia beetles, they can smell the chemicals that plants put out when they're stressed or dying. We cannot smell those things. So we tell that a plant is unhealthy or dying because we look at it and say, okay, it's starting to turn yellow and starting to turn brown. At that point, the plant has already been stressed and dying for a while. These beetles know before you can even tell visually that that plant is stressed or dying. And so a lot of people are going to call you and say ambrosia beetles are killing my plant. For the most part, they're wrong. It's the ambrosia beetles are coming because the plant is stressed in some other way. It could be a root disease, it could be soil pH, it could be all these different things that basically cause that plant to become more suitable for them to burrow into and to create their families and their gardens and things like that. Now, ambrosia beetles are called that because they bore straight into the wood, and they'll actually create these frass sawdust toothpicks coming out. If you see these, you know you have a stress plant because for the most part, that's they're attacking plants like that. What they do is they need those plants to be stressed and dying because they grow fungus inside there to feed on. Bark beetles, on the other hand, feed up and down the very nutritious vascular area of the plants, but again, they're mostly going to be attacking dead and dying plants where they can live. There are a few exceptions. Black twig borers will attack healthy plants, and we've seen a lot of magnolias and other plants getting attacked in the last couple of years. They're very tiny. They bore. You can see this is a fingernail, actually somebody's fingernail. So they're very tiny beetles, and they bore into the twigs, create their galleries, grow their fungus, and the twigs beyond that start to die. And so you may see branches here and there browning in certain plants. So you want to scout for those little tiny holes. The other one is the red bay ambrosia beetle that attacks healthy red bay or bay laurels, sassafras, and spice bush and things like that, and it transmits a fungus that kills the plant. And so those are actually primary pests, but for the most part, I would say more often than not, 8 to 9 times out of 10, if you have bark and ambrosia beetles, it's because something else is going on with your plant. Okay, couple flies. So one pest of boxwood, the next pest of boxwood is really important is the boxwood leaf miner. I should mention that flies are a whole group of insects that contain a lot of different types. In fact, mosquitoes are a type of fly. I don't know how many of you knew that. But flies are distinguished by having only having one pair of wings, and then they have this little knob-like organ on the back of their thorax called a hauteur. That's actually their reduced hind wings. No flies have more than two wings. So if you count only two wings and see those knobs, you know you have a fly. This leaf miner is actually a gall midge. Most gall midges create growths like the gall wasps on plants where the larvae live. But this one actually lays its eggs in new boxwood leaves, and the larvae then live inside and cause these blisters. If you start seeing these blisters on the leaves of boxwoods, break them open, you'll see these little orange or yellow rice-like maggots, and that's the larva of this fly. They only have one generation per year, so you see the adults usually around April, flying when the new growth is coming out. And if you see your boxwoods being swarmed by little orange insects, almost look like little orange mosquitoes, you have boxwood leaf miners flying around. There are chemical controls for them when they're swarming. They're a little easier. There are also chemical controls for the plants when you have the larvae inside the leaves. But they typically don't harm the plants overall. They just cause these little blisters all over it, which are not nice looking if you like your boxwoods nice looking. Now, a completely different type of fly is the daylily leaf miner. This has only been in the U.S. since 2011 and came from Japan, but its larvae live inside the leaves of daylilies. The females will lay their eggs in there, and these maggots travel up and down the daylilies, causing these silver streaks. They won't kill the plant, they just make it look bad. So if you see these silver streaks up and down your daylilies, that's a little fly maggot that's feeding in there. Look for these little tiny black flies flying around them. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to control them because there's so many sources of these flies out there, especially since daylilies are planted on roadsides and places where there's not a lot of control done. So it's basically an uphill battle, but again, they won't kill the plants, they don't affect the flowers, they just leave these silver streaks on the leaves. Okay, finally, mites. So spider mites are a really common group of plant-feeding mites, very minute spider-like mites, and they're called spider mites because they do produce silk If you leave a plant too long in the lab, like we did, you get all this silk all over them. You may even see that in indoor plants, this abundance of silk, and they cause this stippling damage. So they feed on their sucking pests. They feed on the greenery, the green parts. And for instance, this is the boxwood spider mite, the third of the major boxwood pests. And many boxwoods have this. They'll look like little yellow chicken scratches all over the leaves. That means you have boxwood spider mites. Um, these may have many generations per year, and there's all different spider mites out there. Then you have other mites, like the flat mites, which are relatives of spider mites and do the similar damage, and broad mites. Broad mites are a completely different group. The males look like little crabs, but the females look like little footballs, and they have these really distinct knobby eggs. Now, you're probably never going to see them because they're only about a half a millimeter long, and you would need a very high-powered magnification to see them. But you will see their damage. So like they cause damage similar to herbicide damage or maybe some severe viruses, but this is a hydrangea that was affected by the broad mites, and you can see all these leaves are crinkled up. In fact, I just looked at a sample of peppers from a field today, and the leaves are crinkled up. They thought it might be herbicide. There were in fact broad mites on there, and they feed on the new growth, and their saliva causes it to basically twist and knot and things like that. So if you see this twisting, knotting, if it's only happening on one type of plant and not in an area where herbicide might have been sprayed, you should be looking for those or submitting them to the clinic for us to look at them because they are very tiny. And finally, eriophyid mites, one of my favorite groups of mites, even though some can be very severe pests, but they are very tiny. You can see they're less than a quarter of a millimeter long, so they can rest on the leg of a spider mite. And they are on many types of plants. Now, there are many of them that feed just on the plants you would never notice, but others create either distortions or galls or things like that on plants. And some actually transmit viruses. In fact, the rose rosette virus is transmitted by an eriophyid mite. And that's a very severe virus of roses that affects how they look. I would ask people to guess what these are. That's what I usually do when I'm interacting with people. But, well, does anybody want to try and guess? This will be, I think, the last slide of this talk. But anybody want to guess what this is right here? I like to have everybody guess that.
I'm going with kale.
Yeah, that's what they say. Everybody says. That's actually a poplar leaf. And again, the poplar, when it looked under the scope, all these little mites were on top. And so, because their saliva is toxic, it caused the poplar leaf, when it's developing, to not be able to develop correctly. Anybody know what? Can you guess? You want to guess what this one is? It's from a tree.
I'm scared to even guess.
Oh, that's the whole point. It's actually from a black gum, a Nissa. And Nissa gets two types of mainly gets two types of eriophyid mites. If you see black gum with little warts all over the top of the surface, that's one species. But this species here actually creates little crinkles in the edges of the leaves. And if you were to cut them open, you'll find these little tiny worm-like mites. And in fact, today we got a sample in of an ash tree that was declining. And among all the things that it also had eriophyid mites on the leaves. It doesn't look like they were doing any damage, but there are known eriophytes on ash that cause witches' brooms of their fruits and their inflorescences. So that's all I had for this part. Do we want to have questions now, or do we want to just get right into the beneficials thing?
Let's go ahead to the beneficials.
Okay, I'll try to make it real quick. So it's not too. Let's see. Let me see.
So we'll end with the happy bug.
Yeah, that's true. Okay. Let me see where the beneficial talk. Okay, here we go. All right. Let me share my screen. Okay. Okay. And can you see that then? Great. Okay, this is a very brief talk on different types of beneficials to see out there. So my first question is, which is more beneficial for your garden and for your plants, a paper wasp or a praying mantis?
I know which one I'm supposed to pick. Is it really the paper wasp?
Yes, it's the paper wasp. So praying mantises are a generalist predator, which means they will feed on anything they can capture, which means they will also eat beneficials, including things like hummingbirds, and anything they can grab. So bees, but also pests. Whereas paper wasps and hornets and yellow jackets actually are very targeted hunters. They can't feed on solid food themselves, but what they do is they go and find soft food for their young to feed on. And they love caterpillars. In fact, there's a lot of wasps that really love to hunt caterpillars, and so they will specifically hunt for those pests in your on your garden. So if you see a little yellow jacket flying around your garden, it's hovering around to try and find caterpillars to feed its young. And they'll grab the caterpillar, they'll sting it and kill it, they'll butcher it and bring it to the nest, and then feed it to their young that do have mandibles and can eat solid food. So technically, paper wasps are more specific to the pests that you have in your garden, and the mantis may completely only eat beneficials in its lifetime. You have no idea what it's going to eat because it's just going to eat whatever it can find. So it's in the eye of the beholder. This is you probably have all heard this about weeds. So like a weed is a plant that's in the wrong place. A pest is only in light of how you see it. So your pest or weed is one that you don't like or is causing personal issues. A beneficial is an organism that benefits you in some ways, and so it depends on the situation. So the best example is the cactus moth, Cactoblastis cactorum. This is native to Argentina, so it's not an issue there. But it was accidentally introduced into North America, and because we have a lot of native opuntia, the prickly pear cacti, it became a huge pest in North America. However, in Australia, prickly pear, there were huge fields of prickly pear accidentally introduced, and basically people couldn't walk around because it's just giant fields of prickly pear. It was not native to Australia, it was noxious. And so people brought over this caterpillar to eat those prickly pears. And in fact, they put up monuments for those caterpillars there in Australia because, in their mind, the opuntia, the prickly pear cactus, was the pest. Whereas here, the caterpillar is a pest because we have native prickly pears. So it's all in the eye of the beholder. Keep that in mind as we go along. So types of beneficial arthropods. They may directly or indirectly help landscape or garden plants. So there are several functional groups. So they're decomposers and soil tillers. They're predators, they're parasitoids, and pollinators. So decomposers and soil tillers are really important in waste management. So your compost bins only work because these insects are there to break down the major parts, and usually microorganisms break them down even further. So they will dispose of those things. Also, body disposal. You don't want dead animals around your yard all the time. And so most of the dead animal waste out there is being eaten by insects, mostly flies and beetles. Um, they also aerate the soil, some of them, by burying things or digging in the ground. And they may return nutrients to the soil. And these are actually mostly Diptera, which are the true flies, and Coleoptera, the beetles. Those are the two most important groups of decomposers, but there are other insects that will decompose plant and animal material. This, for instance, is a black scavenger fly on some dung. Its larvae will eat that dung and get rid of it. So in compost bins, you're going to see a lot of flies, black scavenger flies, Drosophilids, which are people call fruit flies when they're in the house, but they're more commonly called by fly people vinegar flies or pomace flies, fungus gnats and moth flies. Then you have the soldier flies, which are very good at decomposing all the vegetable waste in your compost bins. And so if you see these large brown things in there swarming, they're really great for that, for breaking it down. And they turn into these wasp-like adults that mimic wasps to get protection. Now, dung is fed on by a lot of insects, including some pest flies, but dung beetles are really important in that they bury the dung. And I actually worked on dung beetles for my master's degree and did an experiment where we showed that they actually return a lot of the nutrients to the soil again. And their digging also increases the aeration of the soil, increases the water percolation, and they feed on the dung, so they get rid of it. One of the most interesting instances where it was an issue was in Australia, where people brought cattle, and all the dung beetles in Australia were only used to these marsupial pellets, and so they have these huge dung pats from the cattle sitting on the ground for years and just becoming rocks and basically fouling the entire environment. So what they did was they introduced a bunch of non-native dung beetles that liked cowpats, and that took care of the problem. So in their absence, this dung just stays there. So again, with all these decomposers, you'd have rotting vegetable matter, dead animals, and dung everywhere without these things. And speaking of dead animals and things, there are lots of things like carrion beetles, flies, and this is a maggot feeding in a dead millipede. So it's gross, but somebody's got to do it. And I don't think you want to eat that dead rodent. So yeah, there's gonna be flies that'll do that for you. Okay, another group of beneficials are the predators. They either actively hunt or ambush prey, and they consume multiple prey items. There are generalists and specialists, like I described, and they often have slicing mandibles or piercing mouthparts, and some are venomous, of course. These are venomous to take down their prey quickly. In fact, this is a little tiny, this is called a gnat ogre, a tiny robber fly on a blade of grass in my yard, and that it's eating a queen needle ant. So right there, it's being beneficial because everybody hates needle ants, and this is eating it, and it's actually injected a venom into it and is sucking it dry. So one of the most important groups of predators are spiders. They are generalist predators, so they eat anything, but they're very important. They've even found that just the silk on leaves of plants can deter pests because they don't like spiders, because spiders are extremely aggressive, well, to pests, very dangerous animals to pests. I mean, I would not want to be a pest with spiders around. Luckily for humans, they're not interested in attacking humans. We are not their food, so don't worry about spider bites or things like that. But note that spiders are very important, but they are generalist predators as well. So they're going to eat whatever they can capture, even other spiders. There are lots of true bugs that are predators. So damsel bugs, assassin bugs, pirate bugs, and big-eyed bugs. They're usually generalist predators, although things like pirate bugs often feed on smaller soft-bodied insects, which happen to be a lot of the pests out there. But again, they will feed on anything they can capture. Stink bugs, there are predatory stink bugs. Not all stink bugs feed on plants. And you got Florida predatory stink bugs. Here's a nymph feeding on a beetle, and spine soldier bugs. All these are predators, and they have these very strong beaks to jab into their prey. Now, how do you tell the stink bug apart? Well, predatory stink bugs have a very thick beak, thicker than the antenna, that starts at the front of the head. And plant feeders have a thin beak that starts a little bit back further. But it's very thin, usually about as thin as the antenna. Okay, now a group that has larvae and adults that both feed on soft-bite insects are the lacewings. So you often see green lacewings flittering around lights at night. Brown lacewings may be there as well. And they have these small lizard-like larvae that have these really sharp mouth parts. They can actually, in fact, bite humans. So they have a venom. And it's painful, but not deadly to humans. But it is deadly to things like aphids and other small soft-bodied insects. And so they can be very voracious predators. And you may see little bits of debris wandering around your yard, looking like a fully autonomous pile of debris, but actually underneath is a lacewing larva. So these are debris-carrying lacewings, and you'll often see lichens or algae or silk or stuff like that walking around, a little fluff ball. That's these little venomous predators. There's a lot of beetles that are generalist predators, like ground beetles. Um, they have these large mouth parts. The larvae are predators. You can see they're very scary looking. Usually, if it's kind of scary looking, it's often a predator because they have those big mouth parts to slice up their prey. Um, and then ladybugs are a really important group. Note that not all ladybugs are red with black on them, and this is actually an imported ladybug, the Vidalia beetle, that specifically feeds on cottony cushion scales. But some ladybugs are actually black with red dots, or even not black, not black overall. They come in all different colors, and the larvae come in all different colors, shapes, and sizes. So some have wax coatings and make them look like mealybugs. Others are large and black and orange. And then these, of this little tiny type of ladybug, you can see these are baby aphids. And so these larvae are very tiny, but still are very voracious predators of aphids. Now, beetles, the ladybugs will feed on all different things, mostly aphids, but also scale insects. Some groups are specific to scale insects, even armored scales. They'll chew right through the armor and eat them. So they are very beneficial. Although note that there are a couple ladybugs, true ladybugs, that actually feed on plants. Okay, there are a lot of wasps that are predators too. So you've got these potter wasps that grab caterpillars. Again, these are actually related to paper wasps, and they often make these mud nests either in tunnels or like just these pots out there, and they'll fill them with caterpillars, which they hunt specifically. Now, fly larvae can also be general predators. So if you see these little legless larvae, maggots on plants, they're oftentimes feeding on aphids. So these fly larvae are very beneficial. And mites. There are many predatory mites out there as well. So the you can even buy certain mite species, and put them in greenhouses or places like that, and they will go and kill other mites or thrips or things like that. So mites are very important predators as well. Okay, parasitoids. So these are parasites that kill their host. There are many types and functional groups. They're mainly Hymenoptera, the wasps and kin, but also some flies and a few other groups are parasitoids. They can inject their eggs into the host. They can attach their eggs on the host, which then hatches and burrows in, or they lay eggs on the leaf material, and then the host eats the leaf and um, and unknowingly consumes an egg of a parasitoid. And many of you have probably seen a hornworm in your garden with all these white things on them. These are not eggs, they're actually the cocoons of the wasps. The wasp larvae burrow out after they're done feeding and spin these silk cocoons, and out of each of those cocoons is an adult wasp is going to come out. So you want to, if you have them in your garden, you'll want to take that caterpillar off, but leave it in the garden so those wasps can emerge and attack more caterpillars. Now, there are all different types of parasitoid wasps. There are ones that drill into wood to find their wood-boring larvae hosts. And here, for instance, I was going to rear out this caterpillar to see what it was, and all that came out of it was a wasp larva. So that was what was left after it ate it. So these things are pretty crazy. And you have a lot of little tiny wasps. This one is next to a penny, and actually the smallest wasps in the world can sit on the head of this thing. The smallest wasps in the world, in fact, are the smallest land arthropods and are smaller than some single-celled organisms. And that's because many of them parasitize the eggs of other insects. So this is a small parasitoid wasp coming out of a leaf-footed bug egg. And you may find aphid mummies on your plants. They're these big, bloated, papery aphids. And inside each one of those is a wasp that was stung. The aphid was stung, an egg was laid inside of it, and that larva of the wasp lived inside that aphid its entire life cycle. Then there's a caterpillar that produced this chalcidoid wasp. So again, they attack lots of different groups. And this, knowing what specific parasitoids is better, but they're just out there doing this thing. And they get tiny, like I said. Here's one feeding on a scale insect, and actually that cleared scale, you can see that's the larva of a wasp inside the scale insect. And this scale is about a millimeter or two long. And so there's this tiny, tiny, tiny little larva inside. And many of them are very beautiful up close, really shiny, really beautiful colorations. Now, flies, like I said, are also can be parasitoids. This fly basically probably got consumed by the caterpillar that made this pupa and lived in it until pupated. And then I tried to rear out, or actually my colleague tried to rear out the moth, but what came out was a fly, and because this had eaten the moth. And then this horrific sight. This is a leaf-footed bug with the egg of a tachinid fly, but one of these types of flies, is glued on its head. And what happens is that larva will then hatch out of the egg underneath and burrow in and eat that insect. So bad luck for that. But if you don't like this bug that's getting killed, then that parasitoid is really great. Okay, and finally, pollinators. So these visit flowers, of course, and transfer pollen. Some are better than others at transferring pollen, and it depends on the plant typically. Some are very specific to certain plants, where others are called polylectic, which means they'll visit all different types of plants. Many are attracted to sweet nectar, and some flowers, though, produce rotting smell to attract flies and beetles. So, for instance, the Titan arum, which is this very large, they call it the corpse flower, that it's a huge flower and it smells like rotten meat because its main pollinators are beetles and flies, which we already talked about are the decomposers. And so it fools those insects into thinking that it's rotten meat when it's really a flower. And even carpenter bees, which a lot of people consider huge pests of wood, they are good pollinators because bees are very good pollinators typically. But it's not just bees. So there's lots of things that pollinate flowers. Beetles, wasps, not just bees. Bees are technically a type of wasp. Butterflies and even flies will pollinate them. In fact, I'm sure most of you like chocolate, and I don't know if you know this, but chocolate is only pollinated by flies, really tiny flies. In fact, they're close relatives of the punkies and no-see-ums that bite people at the beach. So every time they're biting you, just think that at least one of their relatives is doing something good by pollinating chocolate. But pollinators are very important, of course, but mostly for the flowers and the plants to survive. And they're very good for that. Of course, if crops are pollinated by insects, we need those insects there to make sure fruit develops and things like that. So, to promote beneficials, what do you do? So, limit broad spectrum chemicals. Chemicals that will kill mosquitoes will kill most other insects. So, if you spray your yard fog your yard with mosquito spray, it's not safe for beneficials either. This is also why you should time certain chemicals. So you don't want to pour a drench of a chemical on a plant that's about to produce flowers because the chemical gets in the pollen, the bees eat the pollen, the bees then die, or other insects do. Um, Plant native flowers and keep some wild native plants for beneficial food, so nectar and larval hosts. So the plants, a lot of people plant exotic plants in their yards. That's great, but you'll notice they typically don't get any pests on them except for the exotic pests or things like that. And so it just goes to show that those plants are not desirable for local insects, which means also you're not supporting these beneficials sometimes. So planting a wide variety of flowers and flowering plants around your yard can really help because a lot of, for instance, those parasitoid wasps will go and take nectar in order to be able to fly around to find their hosts. The predators will also then feed on insects that come to those flowers to feed. And it's basically making more of a natural habitat and add some 3D environment. So they don't like to be out in the open. So add bushes and short plants, tall plants. They really like a variety of places to hunt for their prey and to get food, basically. So these are ways you can promote beneficials. And with that, uh, we can open up for questions.
That was wonderful. And I'm glad we were able to record this because I think I'll be coming back to, check out some of the photos and see what I've got in my yard. So do any of you guys have any questions? Feel free to just, unmute yourself and ask.
I have a question.
Sure.
We have two maple trees and there's numerous holes been drilled in the tree. One, it's almost killed it, the other's still living. What would be causing that?
Yeah, so like I said, when there's things that are drilling holes in trees, especially maples, I would say there's something else going on with that tree. It's usually some other issue, soil issues, root diseases, things like that, that basically stress the tree out. It could also be that the tree's planted in the wrong spot or somewhere. We see that a lot with urban trees where they're near roads and places where there's a lot of heat. When they get stressed, the plants attract these secondary things that think they're dying. And so they can push them over the edge. But typically, you wouldn't get a maple getting killed by something that's boring into it. The bore holes are really probably some kind of longhorn beetle or something like that that is coming in after the fact. Now, again, Asian longhorn beetle we do know is a primary pest of maples, but it's not here in North Carolina right now. So really, there are very few insects that would bore into a maple that would kill it outright. They're almost certainly going to be secondary. And what you should do is then take that as a sign that there's something else going on and investigate for the other reasons why a maple will be declining and dying.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, good question. Anyone else?
Yes, I have
yeah,
a
go-
question. Does
ahead.
it, following along with that lady was talking about, if we see woodpeckers or flickers or those types of animals pecking into the trees, does that generally mean that the tree is infested, or is that just the nature of that bird?
Yeah, so it depends a little. So sapsuckers are a woodpecker that will, I've never actually seen a sapsucker, but you see their damage everywhere. They actually are called that because they drill holes into different types of trees or chisel away the bark a little bit, and they feed on the sap that comes out, or they'll also feed on insects that get attracted to that sap as well. So they oftentimes don't damage a tree so much that the tree won't recover, but every once in a while they will girdle a tree completely and cause the plant above that area to die off. Um, if it's a woodpecker that's kind of chipping away at the wood, that is almost certainly the wood is dead, and there's these grubs, these longhorn beetle larvae, these really big, juicy, very tasty things to a woodpecker in there. But again, it's the same thing where they're typically going to be secondary. You won't really have wood borers that woodpeckers like in a healthy plant or a healthy branch. A tree can have many limbs that start to die, say they shade out or things like that. Insects will invade that wood, but won't invade then the healthy parts of the plant. And in fact, ambrosia beetles I've seen on campus. My favorite example is there were all these multi-stem fig trees or fig plants on campus, really nice, healthy ones. And I went out, I was out taking photos, and I saw, and there were a bunch of those frass toothpicks, those sawdust toothpicks coming out of one stem of the same plant. No other stems were being attacked, and you could tell that that stem had freeze damage. It had cracks up and down it, and so the beetles were preferentially attacking that. And they've even done studies where they've put those beetles in cages and strapped them to the next to trees. And the beetles are not interested at all in healthy trees, but if you start to stress out the trees by putting too much water or too little water, those beetles will attack that plant right away. So I would say with woodpeckers, especially if they're taking chips out, that wood is already dead, and that plant is already kind of declined enough for it to have the food for those woodpeckers. So I would investigate a little further and see why they're there, and whether that whole section or part of the plant is dead or dying.
Anyone else?
Thank you.
Oh,
Good
you're
question,
welcome.
Teresa.
I will say that also pines get this a lot. So a lot of people say, "Oh, the pine beetles killed my pine." That's almost not the case. So, in fact, we haven't had a severe southern pine beetle outbreak. Now, southern pine beetles is a bark beetle that will attack healthy trees. It is a very big concern in the southeast and even in the northeast now because of warming temperatures. But we have not had an outbreak of pine beetles in North Carolina in about 20 years. So, and when you do see them, they attack the tree that's healthy, and the tree starts producing resin flows, and you get these little popcorn bits on them. If you see dry holes in a pine tree, just holes in the tree, that means it's died or dying from some other reason. The tree pines will produce resin specifically to plug up and push out beetles and insects that primarily attack them. And so it's a defense mechanism. It's not actually sap. It's a substance that pines make called resin. And so if you see lots of resin balls or dried resin somewhere, you know there's something going on with a healthy tree that's still trying to fight it. If you see dry holes, that means that those things have entered after the tree doesn't have any resin or isn't trying to protect itself, which means it's probably stressed in some other way. So I would investigate further for some other reasons why it's that way.
Anyone else?
I have more. I see you want to go.
Sure.
You go ahead and go.
Hello. Um, if you get a plant that you buy from somewhere and there is a fire ant nest in it, what would be the best way of trying to get rid of that nest? And then also just if they spread to the yard, like are there things that are better than others to try to get rid of the fire ants but not hurt any other beneficial insects?
Yeah, well, fire ants are pretty common in the environment anyway. If they're in a plant pot that you buy, just protect yourself. Make sure you don't get stung or anything like that. I wouldn't say that there's probably a lot of things you can do with to kill that. That won't kill the plant. You could try a hot water dunk or something like that. That may not be hot enough to kill a plant, but will kill the fire ants. But honestly, if you could just plant it and leave it be, unless there's the queen there, they won't start a new colony. But you're still going to get fire ants anyway in yards all around. They actually like disturbed areas. You won't see fire ants, for instance, in the woods or somewhere where it's nice and natural. They typically like lawns and work sites and places like that where there's a lot of disruption. And so, for if you get fire ants, besides getting them from a plant that you've gotten, and again, they're not going to harm the plant really. Although we did have an interesting examples for a couple years now of hemp getting chewed on and stung by fire ants, which is totally weird. We think it may be a water thing. They're looking for water in the hot summer. But for the most part, they're not going to harm your plants. And in fact, they're sometimes beneficial because they do eat pests. They're predators. But people don't like them, of course, because they sting. So there are some granular baits and some pour-ons, like some chemicals that can be used. I would just look up some fact sheets about fire ants from NC State, and they'll tell you some of the products that can be used. But fire ants are just kind of one of those things that are just always out there, and you really can't prevent them from, they're flying, the reproductives fly around, so they spread, and when they land in a spot that they like, they're going to create a nest. So.
Can you guys see this? It's Medina orange oil. And Debbie Ruse at the Chatham Garden in Pittsburgh,
Yeah.
that's what she uses
Oh, interesting.
as a drench
Okay.
on the nest. And she's got some good results from that. I have not used it yet, but I
What
have
is
a
it?
bottle. It's called Medina orange oil.
Huh.
And
Is it for pests or is it like a furniture polish?
well, it says that's a good question. Multi-purpose cleaner and degreaser, it's
Okay.
called. Yeah,
Okay.
I took a picture of that in her garden. Let me get her recipe as well. Why?
Yeah, there are other products too, I think.
Oh yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah. So just I think and if you have any questions, you can always ask our specialists in the department. Dr. Sydney Crawley is our new urban and structural pests extension person, and she's an expert on those things. So she can help you out if you have specific questions. Fire ants are just a common problem. Again, they're one though. Again, it's the eye of the beholder. So they've known for some time now that they can be very important in agriculture, where they feed on pests and kill pests. Again, so if it's not bothering you, if the nest is somewhere out of the way, you rarely get stung by fire ants far away from the nest. It's really when they boil out of the nest and you stumble in there and you get thousands of them coming out and biting and stinging you. That's when they're annoying, of course, and more than annoying. But if you can avoid those nests, or if they're somewhere else, you don't have to control every fire ant nest around. But if you want to, you can.
Yeah, their nests are so big usually that you see them. If you kind of pay attention where you are and you don't step on them, they pretty much leave you alone.
Yeah, the needle ants are worse in some ways, or they're better in some ways in that they're not super aggressive when you find a nest, say. They're not out like running at you, trying to bite and sting you, but they are very common everywhere, especially in gardens and mulch and in the woods everywhere. And they have a very painful sting.
What are those called? Are they black?
Yes, they're black. They're kind of elongate. They're not huge. They're kind of a medium-sized ant, and they are called needle ants. And they are an
Okay.
invasive species. They've been in North Carolina for about, I want to say 15 years or so, 16, or they've been in the U.S. for a while, but they really ramped up recently, and they're found all
Okay.
over. They just found them in Indiana, in fact, too. But they are kind of slow-moving black ants. They kind of crawl around. Can be beneficial in that they prefer termites, so they like to eat termites. but they also displace a lot of other ants, native ants, because they do nest in natural areas. And if you get them down your shirt, like me and my wife do when we're gardening, or you lift up a piece of rotten wood in the yard and they fall onto you, they will
Yep.
sting because they're freaking out because you're going to squish them, and so of course they're going to sting, but it doesn't feel good. Of course, it does
Well,
feel like
I'm-
little needles.
I'm
I
really
met one of those just the other day, as
Yeah.
a matter of fact. Yes.
I'm real allergic to them, and they just seem to love me for some particular reason. I was sitting on the
No.
porch and one fell
Yep.
from the sky. I don't know. It was crawling along, I guess, and just I've had quite a bit of trouble. And I wanted to ask you, this is about biting things. What would be something that is white and fluffy looking, sort of fluffy looking, that stings or bites? Because I have been bitten by whatever this is once or twice, and I get quite a big welt, from it. And you
Yeah.
said lace wings, and I was wondering,
Mm.
because it's not a very big bug, it's not very
Yeah.
big.
No, that if you say white and fluffy and biting, that's the only thing I can think of. Most of the other white and fluffy things are like aphids and things that can't bite people. But those lacewing larvae, they will bite. I've been bitten by them. It hurts a good bit. It
Do
does
they
leave a
have
little
venom?
welt. They do have venom.
Okay.
And I will say that going back to the needle ants, that some people are allergic to needle ants, so they can pose a big problem. My
Okay.
wife, when she put a bunch of compost in our garden, there was a whole colony in there one year, and they were just crawling all over everything. And so she was trying to garden, and she said, I don't know. So we used actually a carpenter ant bait, which was like one for protein, predatory ants, things that like a lot of protein. And that seemed to take care of them pretty well, but it's really difficult to eradicate needle ants from a whole area. Basically,
Okay.
they're just everywhere. You can maybe get rid of a close colony that's nearby where your garden is, but you're never going to get rid of them from a whole
Well,
area. They're very
the
difficult.
bite feels really, I know when I've been bitten by them because it feels distinctly different. It's almost as if the little, I don't know, it just feels like what a bee bite would be like with the stinger in there. They're
Well,
very sharp and very painful.
the needle ants, is that what you're talking about?
Yes,
Yeah, so
yes.
well, I should mention that ants are wasps. They're technically a wasp and they are stinging you.
Oh,
So ants do bite. There's some ants that only bite, they can't sting. But when a fire ant is biting you in quotes, or a needle ant is biting you, that's actually the sting. They have a stinger and they're
oh,
injecting venom. So that's why people are allergic to
oh.
them, and there can be some cross allergies with other wasp stings, because technically ants are just ground nesting wasps that are social.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. So when people say, fire ants bit me, technically they stung you. They do bite to latch
Okay.
on so they can give you a good sting,
A good
but
one,
the
yeah.
biting is not what's hurting you. It's the sting, the venom that's really causing the issue.
So if I'm allergic to bees, that's why I'm having such a stronger reaction to the wasp bites or the ant bites.
It may be. There is some. It's hard to tell sometimes. Different people can be allergic to, say, more to bees than to hornets or yellow
Okay.
jackets. But you may go get testing and with an allergist to figure out what you're most allergic to, and kind of have a plan for those. But if if you just swell up a little bit, it's not, but if you start having breathing issues or things like that, that's something to really be careful of.
Right. Well,
And just
I
make
have
sure
my
you know.
EpiPen if that really becomes a problem. I just come in and take we have
Benadryl.
this thing that sucks the bite.
Oh
I don't know
yeah.
how to explain it. And that works pretty good. And then I take a Benadryl.
Yep.
That's-
There are a few things you could do.
And then I go to sleep.
Yep. Yep. But yeah,
Okay.
it's a venom. So many of those things, needle ants use that venom to kill their prey. So they sting the termite, for instance, and that
I
kills the
see.
termite. You can imagine how painful it is for the termite. And then they eat those things. They bring them back to the nest and feed them to their young,
Interesting.
little larvae and
Interesting.
everything. Yep. Yep. So yeah.
Any more questions, guys? We've had some good fun with the insects, haven't we?
All right. Can I ask one more question?
Yeah.
There's a battle about carpenter ants at my house. Not carpenter ants, carpenter bees.
Yeah.
My husband does not like them, and I think you confirmed that they do pollinate plants. What's the best way
Yeah.
to encourage them to stop eating our deck? And
Unfortunately, there's nothing. There's nothing
okay,
you could do other than making your deck out of material that they don't like, which is
okay,
synthetic things and whatnot.
okay.
You could put metal sheeting under on everything. That takes a
Oh,
lot of
okay,
money and time. There are definitely ways you can stop them, but nothing really economical or easy to do.
okay.
Unfortunately, what I like to say is that we unfortunately got rid of all their habitat because they would normally be nesting in dead trees and things like that.
Okay.
But we happen to also provide them with nice wood, and so they are around. They are annoying. You can if you block up the hole, they're just going to choose some other way out, which makes more damage. They will reuse
Mm,
nests every year, but many times they'll extend them as well.
okay.
There are, you can there's some talks about you can put powders or some kind of liquids in the nests, but they're not super effective, and it's hard to guarantee that you're getting them. The little traps that you buy that trap them, they kind of work a little bit. They kind of don't work. It's really difficult. Nobody has figured out a magic solution yet. We do have a researcher on campus, though, a colleague of mine, Dr. Elsa Youngstead in applied ecology, who's actually doing a lot of work right now on carpenter bees. She's a native bee and bee expert, and she has actually put out a bunch of benches, and each slat is made of a
Mhm.
different type of wood or type of
Interesting.
thing, and then she's looking and X-raying them to see how much damage is being done by the carpenter bees to them. So this will help kind of guide people on what products to use to build things out of. But it's yeah, carpenter bees are tough. They
Right.
don't eat the wood, they just excavate it. So the
Yeah,
wood,
they're not,
treated
they're
wood.
just digging holes.
Yep,
What
yep.
what was her name?
Elsa Youngstead. She's in applied ecology. She's actually a graduate from our department as well, which is interesting. We have known each other for a long time. I do have carpenter bees right now munching in my deck. You can hear them at night chewing away. And again, they're just excavating the holes to make a nest. They don't feed on the wood. The larvae feed on pollen, and they basically make these cells where the larvae live, and they basically make these pollen balls in each cell in that
Oh,
that wood tunnel. And so there are also, if you see these very large flies, here I'll show you. Let's see, show it real quick. Um, One of my favorite flies actually around is this one.
It would be interesting to figure out if there's a certain type of wood that they like better, and you could like build them something over to the side and they
right.
would go for that, and leave my house alone.
It would be
That's a
great.
great idea. I was wondering what trees they ate, like what dead trees, because we've decided to just not burn those up anymore, but to make areas for them to actually, for the insects to go to.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
provide more environment for them, they're going to be less likely to use yours, although they're very common still.
Yes.
But if you see these flies around, this
Yes.
very large fly with black and white wings and black patterns and stuff, uh, this one just emerged. That's a carpenter bee hole, so you can see how big these flies are.
Wow.
And those are the shed skins. These are parasites of carpenter bees. I actually raised one last year because Elsa
Oh,
had found some in the nest she was looking in and gave it to me. And so what they do is they shoot their eggs into the nests, and their larvae then hop over, and they have no legs. They crawl over to the larvae of the bees, attach on, and suck them dry basically, and then emerge as this.
wow.
So interesting fly. The flies don't bite at all. They're completely beneficial to us because they hunt carpenter bees, but they also don't do 100% control. So they're not going to kill every carpenter bee out there. But fortunately, these things are out there helping to keep the populations down as well.
Well,
Well, the
that's
flip side
neat.
about the carpenter bee though
Exactly.
is that it's a
It's
pollinator,
a
right?
pollinator also, yep. And
Yep.
in nature again, they're going to be one of the primary decomposers of wood. So they're going to be making these huge holes in dead trees that then allow the tree to start to decompose, which then brings nutrients back to the soil, which allows other
Uh,
trees to grow.
and
So
the
yeah,
holes actually allow spores of the type of mushrooms that would necessarily help break down that tree to get
Ex-
in there.
Exactly. So
That's how
they,
they
that-
gain entry.
Yep. So they're technically beneficial if we weren't here and we weren't building our houses out of wood. So unfortunately,
Yeah,
we
that.
do.
Yeah, that. So,
Yeah.
and do
Yeah.
you know anything about milky spore?
I don't know much about that. I don't know how you would use it. But yeah, I don't know anything
We've
about that.
we've used
Unfortunately.
it for we've tracked where the Japanese beetles were laying their larvae. And in the fall, we dug the areas back and put the milky spore down, and it really has helped. I didn't know if you guys were studying that or not.
Not me. I don't do any
Okay.
research on that stuff. Sorry.
Okay. All right, just a question, because you guys are
Yep.
doing everything there. It's very interesting, all your programs and things that you have going on there. It's really cool. Thank you
Well,
so much
thanks.
for sharing all of your knowledge and information.
No problem.
Yeah, my friend
Yeah.
called and said, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "I'm learning about insects and bugs. Leave me alone."
Yep.
Thank you.
And just to say that the majority of these arthropods out there are not going to harm anybody, not going to harm your plants, or they're natural in our ecosystem, and the plants have evolved to live with these things. Just like a big oak, if you were to send me a twig with 6 leaves on it from a mature oak, you're going to find probably about a dozen different types of feeding damage, of insects just living on there, feeding on it, whatever. That oak is perfectly fine and happy. It's evolved over thousands or millions of years with these insects. And so, really, I would say most of the issues are when things start to look bad for people. I mean, a plant that's growing weird looks bad for a person, but the plant doesn't care. So, unfortunately, a lot of these issues are man made issues, either planting too much of a thing out there or not having a tolerance for when plants don't look perfect or whatnot. So, and most of the insects out there are harmless or beneficial. So,
Well, see, that's perfect to know that.
yeah.
That's-
But
We
I'm
just need to
here
learn
if
to
you
live
have
with them.
questions about. Yep, and if you want to know what it is, I'm always around at the clinic, and you can always email me or submit. I would say submit photos through our system, and or samples, and we'll help you identify what's going on with your plants or your house or whatever.
That's wonderful. And I'm sure the master gardeners that are on this, that we've got public and master gardeners on here. I'm sure that we have used you when we had questions. We've used your group
Yeah.
to help us figure out things when people send questions to the grow line and we're like, yeah, I have no idea what that is.
Well,
So
that's our
wonderful
job,
to have
and
you.
we enjoy
I
doing
know,
it.
I know. It's wonderful. Well, I appreciate it, Matt.
Yeah, no problem.
Is his address listed in the chat?
No, but I will get it. Hold on.
Thank
It'll
you.
take me just a second.
And I will share with you the talks, so you have these as reference. So,
Great.
Okay, wonderful.
okay. Well, thanks for tuning in, and happy gardening. Stay cool out there. This weekend's supposed to be nice, very nice, and I'm looking forward to getting outside and stuff. And yeah, just keep an eye out on the things out there. You're gonna find a lot of critters out there, but like I said, most of them are just kind of doing their own thing, not harming anyone or anything.
Thank you.
So, yeah.
Sorry, guys, I am getting his address here. Sorry, I'm slow. Actually, Matt, can you put it in?
Yeah, let's see, where's the chat?
You know
Okay.
it.
Yep, here. It's if I can spell my name right, that would work. Let's see.
Yeah.
There you go. Okay, so that's my email address. And I would
Awesome.
say here, I'll give you one more link for. So here is our website. And basically on the left-hand side, if you click on that, you go to the web on the left-hand side, you'll see how to submit a sample. And that's a good way to instruct you on how to submit physical samples or image samples to the clinic, and what you should do, how to best collect a sample depending on your situation.
That's excellent to know. Wonderful. It's a
Yeah.
great resource. Thank you very much, Matt. It's been a pleasure. And we will post this hopefully by the end of next week so you can all watch it again and again.
Great. Well, thanks for inviting me, and hope you all enjoyed it and have a great night.
You too. Thank you all.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.